Thanks, Maria. And thank you, Jodie, for that fabulous presentation. Really set the bar very high. So, as Maria said, my name is 𝗝𝗰𝗶H and I'm a chartered psychologist. So, what I hope to do this evening is to bring you through the process for getting a formal diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. Um, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, there's a lot of people out there who don't need or want diagnosis, and who identify as autistic without a formal diagnosis. But there's also probably a lot of you out there who are either thinking about the process in terms of their children or themselves. So tonight I hope to go through that process and give you a little bit more information on it. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the ASD diagnostic criteria, have a look at the assessment procedure, and then a female presentation. Okay. So the ASD diagnostic criteria, as per the DSM-5 2013, looks at a dyad of criteria. So there's social communication and then restrictive routines and behaviors. So there needs to be difficulties in both areas to meet the criteria for diagnosis. So when you go for an assessment, that is what the clinician will be looking at. They'll be looking at your background and any information that you have to give them in terms of both of those areas. So we'll be looking at the ASD in terms of social skills, communication skills, both non-verbal and verbal, routines and rigidity, so restricted interest, and sensory issues. So a combination of all of those areas. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at tonight is the procedure for both child assessment and for adult assessment. So there's some overlap, and there's some areas that are similar on both of them, and then there's some that are slightly different. So in terms of an assessment for a child, the clinician would ask you to provide as much background information as you possibly can, and if you can give, the more information you can give, the easier it is then for the diagnostic interview to be probably as concise and as easy as possible. You'll also be asked to complete some questionnaires in relation to your child. So these questionnaires will be looking at both adaptive functioning and executive functioning, and you'll be asked to fill them out as parents, to get the child's teachers to fill them out, and then depending on the age of the child, there will be some forms that they will be asked to fill out themselves. Then again, depending on the age of the child, there will be a school observation in the school setting, there will be a cognitive assessment, diagnostic interview with parents and the child, and then culminating in a report that will summarize all of the information that was obtained throughout the assessment, confirmation of diagnosis if the diagnosis is there, and then some recommendations. And for most people, the most important piece are obviously the recommendations. For an adult, the procedure is pretty much in line with the child's assessment, except there'll be some areas that won't happen. So again, gathering as much background information as possible, questionnaires in relation to adaptive functioning and executive functioning, the diagnostic interview, and then the report, which again summarizes everything that happened at the assessment, confirmation of a diagnosis if it is there, and some recommendations. So let's have a look at each of those areas individually now. So gathering as much background information as possible. So where possible, so obviously keeping in mind that for some adults, it isn't possible to get some of this information. And that does not mean that you can't go through the process and you can't have assessment, but it's just, if possible, to provide this information. So in terms of mother's pregnancy and the births, developmental milestones, so speech and language, toilet training, and motor skills, for example, walking. So as much information as you can possibly provide in advance of the diagnostic interview, and then any existing reports. So again, for adults, this may not be available to them. They may be aware of an assessment that happened when they were a child, but they may not have the reports. But so as I said, as much information as possible, but don't overstress or don't think, oh God, I don't have that now, I can't do it. Yes, you can. So just, but if you can, give as much detail as possible. Okay, so the questionnaires, again, for both children and adults, should be provided with questionnaires in relation to adaptive functioning. So adaptive functioning is all our everyday skills. So your communication skills, social skills, daily living skills, self-care, all of the everyday skills. So there's a variety of different ways that can be assessed. So the Vineland and the ABAS are just two examples of the forms that might be provided to have completed it. And as I said earlier, for a child, it will be a parent form, teacher form, and depending on the age of the child, they may have one themselves. And then for adults, they will complete that form themselves. Sometimes they might consult with maybe a partner or a sibling or a parent while they're completing them, but it'll be a form that they will fill out themselves. The second questionnaire that you would be asked to fill in is in relation to executive functioning. So executive functioning is our organizational skills, our ability maybe to move from one thing to the next. So transitions and organization skill, planning, all of that type of stuff. And again, there's a variety of different tools that may be used here. The brief is one child form that may be used, and then the BDEFS is an adult one. Again, they'll be similar. There'll be for the children, there'll be a parent, teacher, and depending on the age of the child, there may be one for themselves. The BDEFS has two parts. There's the self-report, and then there's the other report. So again, you will be asked to maybe have somebody, if it's a parent, it's possible, maybe a partner, a friend, a sibling, but somebody who may be able to just give a slightly different perspective than yourself. But again, don't panic, don't stress if that's not possible. It's great if it can be, but it doesn't get in the way if it's not possible. Okay, so obviously this piece is only for children, so school or home observation. In the practice that I work in, we would preferably go for a school observation because it gives you, a variety of either interactions with the teacher, interactions through the formal teaching, school break time, social interactions. Okay, so the observer would be just a kind of unidentified observer sitting somewhere in the class, in the back of the class, out of the way, just literally observing what's going on. And for this piece, it is actually really important that the child isn't aware that they are being observed. So, it would be somebody the child hadn't met. It'd be, you wouldn't give them any notice or anything like that. The teacher usually in my own experience, teacher can introduce you to the class in a variety of different ways. They usually focus on you being there to watch them. So they might say, oh, Jacinta, is interested in being a teacher, so she's here to see what it's like, or, so. But the teacher introduces you and then you kind of stay in the background. So it's really having a look at how the child responds to the teacher, their attention, their understanding of any instructions, how they interact with each other, is the child indistinguishable from their peers, or is there any noticeable differences across the break time? What is their play like? Is it solitary? Do they interact with their peers? One thing that comes up quite a lot in this area is when if the assessment is for a female child. It's quite common that you go into the school and the teacher might go, God, I don't even know why you're here, so and it can be really, really interesting because you have to look quite closely maybe to see some of the stuff. So the child might be maybe attached to one other child and kind of following them and taking their lead from them, or they might be slightly on the outside. They might be kind of misunderstanding some stuff in the game. But sometimes it can be quite difficult to see, and as I said, it's quite common for the teachers not to have noticed because they're watching in general just how things are going on the yard, and they're not noticing small things. So as I said, with girls, you need a sharp eye and to be really watching the small little interactions. Okay. Cognitive profile. So again, with children, we would generally do a cognitive assessment, and what we're trying to see here is the overall profile and any kind of inconsistencies or or kind of what we might expect to see for a child who may end up with a diagnosis of autism, or a child who may not. A lot of the time, like, it's not unusual that the full scale IQ can't be quoted because of the variety in the different scores. And it's also not unusual for there to be a clear difference between, say, verbal and perceptual skills would be along the same lines, and then there might be a dip in ability in terms of working memory and processing speed. So it's not unusual to see that in a profile for a child who ultimately ends up with a diagnosis of autism. Okay, so the diagnostic interview, again, this piece happens for both children and for adults. For a child, depending on the child's age, the diagnostic interview would happen with the child and the parent, or if the child is very young, it would be just with the parents, because it can be quite a long process. So it's difficult to have a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old present for a 3-hour interview. So I know in practice I work in, what we normally do is we will do both on the one day. So we'd have the child in with the parents for the kind of the observation piece, a little bit of interaction, and then the child would go to a separate room with the educational psychologist to have the cognitive piece completed, while the second psychologist would do the diagnostic interview with the parents. Okay, for an adult, and an accompanying family member or a friend can usually be requested. And again, I'm only speaking from my personal experience and the practice that I work in. We do always ask for somebody to come along. Again, as I said earlier on, it's not necessary. It's not going to exclude you from having an assessment, but I've found that it is very useful for a number of ways. It doesn't have to be a specific person. We generally ask if a parent is available. Brilliant, because for the simple reason that they can fill in the early years, the big gaps where you mightn't remember yourself, or a parent, or maybe an older sibling can fill out. But it can be anybody. It can be a partner, it can be a friend, but just somebody who knows you well. And the second reason why I usually would kind of suggest this is that it's good to have somebody there as support. So somebody there who's going, who's there for the interview, who's there to support you, who's going to support you afterwards, who's going to be there to maybe fill in the gaps of the bit you mightn't remember. I don't know anybody else out there, but I know even, say, a doctor's appointment, it's nice to have somebody. I like to have somebody with me that can, fill in the gaps of the bits I forgot or I missed. So for those two reasons, so for filling in the gaps in terms of maybe the early years, for a different perspective, and for support for the person being assessed, because it's quite a long process. You could be there for 2-3 hours, and the whole focus is on, it's on your life, and it can be a difficult process to sit through on your own. So if possible to have somebody with you, but it's not a requirement. So the diagnostic interview itself can be guided by a variety of different tools. So a couple of those examples of are the Autism Diagnostic Interview revised, so the ADIR, the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, the Asperger Syndrome Diagnostic Interview, and then the overall diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5. So the clinician doing the interview will be using one or two of those tools as a guide to the diagnostic interview. Okay, so the final piece, just in terms of after the diagnostic interview, I mentioned earlier on that the final piece would be the report. So for most people, as I said, the key piece is confirmation of the diagnosis if it's there, and then some recommendations. So that is the most important piece, that you do get something afterwards, that you can your piece of paper to confirm or to exclude the diagnosis, and to also include a variety of recommendations that are specific to you and to what you have described, the difficulties you might have, or and also the strengths that you have that you can really make use of throughout the diagnostic.
Sorry, I'm only reminding you 2 minutes to
Oh
go.
my God. Okay, thanks, Rita. Sorry, everybody. I thought I had more time. So I just want to quickly have a look at the female presentation. So the NICE guidelines do suggest that autism in girls may be underdiagnosed, and a lot of the time to do with, say masking and are leading to later on diagnosis. So, say when demand outweighs ability, and it's quite common for maybe in the teenage years when the structure of, say, primary school is gone and there's more say making friends is more down to the individual, etc. So when demand outweighs ability, that can happen at any age, because there's a couple of points, say secondary school or into college, or in adulthood, or as Jodie mentioned earlier on, when you have your own children. Okay, so in female presentation, the in terms of social and communication, masking comes up a lot. So being able to watch others, being able to create be able to imitate and mask, but what ultimately can happen here is that, and a little bit like what I was saying earlier on about the teachers maybe saying, they didn't notice girls. So what can happen is the pressure and the pressure of masking all day can mean that you're managing outside in the public environments, etc., and then at home can be meltdowns and become really, really overwhelming. You are going to get these slides, so you can have a read through this yourself. And I just want to flick onto the other side, the restrictive routines and behaviours. So in a lot of cases, a little bit like what Jodie mentioned early on, a lot of the time female interest can be very socially acceptable. And the research shows that some of the restricted and repetitive patterns can be more typical and same age. So say, for example, a girl may be into the same band as her peers, but may just be that little bit extra, might know every single thing there is to know, and the interest might go on a little bit longer after her peers maybe have moved on. Just want to quickly have a look at the spectrum within the spectrum, and just remind people that it's not a linear process. So it's not where you are on the spectrum or where somebody is on the spectrum. And just to have a look at this, the Mighty Wheel article by Nira Birch. So if anybody wants to have a look at that, it's a really lovely article that looks at how the individual wheel of presentation for each individual person. And I'm just going to quickly finish off, and Marie's going to tell me and I'm sure loads of you have already seen this quote, but just to, for yourself and your clinician, just to remember, if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So that's just emphasizing the individuality. Thank you for listening.